What if the darkest secrets are hidden in plain sight? A pastor with a hidden life, a mysterious cabin, and a shocking truth. One man's desperate search for his missing sister leads him into a nightmare he never expected. But what if the truth is more terrifying than anything he could have imagined? Stay with us, because this chilling story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the dark side of human nature. Don't click away. You won't believe what happens next. The small town sat still under a blanket of fog. The air was thick. It clung to everything. The church tower loomed in the distance, a silent guardian of secrets long buried. Inside, the pews were empty save for one.
A man.
Pastor Allen. He stood before the altar, his hands trembling as he gripped the Bible. His lips moved silently. His eyes, though, were fixed on something beyond the altar, beyond the stained glass windows that flickered with muted colors. His heartbeat echoed in his chest. Each thud felt like a countdown. The world outside felt distant, too far. As the sun sank lower, shadows crawled through the church. The smell of incense mixed with dust. The faint rustle of a hymn book on the far side of the room. But the pastor stood motionless. His mind was elsewhere, a place darker than the shadows that wrapped around the pews. He had lived this life for years, a life of righteousness, a life of faith. But no one knew the truth that twisted inside him like a coil, the truth he couldn't let anyone see. Outside, the fog thickened. A car slowed at the church gates. The headlights sliced through the mist. A single figure stepped out.
A man.
Tall, broad-shouldered, his face hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. He walked toward the door, each step echoing like a drumbeat in Alan's mind. It was him, the man he had been waiting for, the man who had promised everything. Pastor Allen's eyes narrowed. His palms were sweaty. His stomach churned. The door creaked open. The man entered. His footsteps were quiet, like a predator closing in. Alan's breath hitched. The silence between them was deafening. For a moment, neither spoke. But the pastor knew. He knew this was it. The man moved closer, his presence heavy, suffocating. And then a sound. The sharp crack of a door slamming shut. Alan snapped his head to the side. The room seemed to shrink. The man reached into his coat. Alan's heart skipped. A flash of metal. The cold gleam of a knife. The air grew colder still. Pastor Allen took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. His entire body froze. Too late. The man lunged. A flash. Then darkness. The blade sliced through the air with terrifying precision. Alan felt the cold steel tear into his skin. Pain shot through him like wildfire. He gasped, struggling to catch his breath. But the grip on his throat tightened. The world around him blurred. The church, his sanctuary, felt like a distant memory. His legs buckled beneath him, but the man held him up. The pastor's vision grew dim. His pulse was fading with each passing second. The man's breath was steady, cold, calculating. The room was eerily silent, save for the shallow gasps escaping Alan's lips. A drop of blood fell to the floor, splattering on the cold stone. It echoed. The man's hand was firm on the knife. It wasn't just a strike, it was deliberate. He wanted the pastor to feel it, to understand the weight of the betrayal. Alan's eyes widened. Tears blurred his vision. The truth had come to light. The truth he had hidden so deep within himself. And now it was too late. The man's face remained hidden in the shadows. But Alan could feel his eyes burning into him. The pastor tried to speak. A muffled cry escaped him. But no words formed. His breath was growing shallow. With a final twist of the knife, the man pulled back. Alan's body crumpled to the floor. The echo of the fall resonated through the empty church. The air was thick with the smell of blood. The man stood over him. The silence stretched, suffocating. Outside, the fog continued to creep in, swallowing the world whole. And in that moment, the truth was finally revealed. The pastor was not the man he appeared to be. He wasn't the gentle shepherd guiding his flock. He wasn't the man they prayed for. He had been hiding something. Something dark. Something sinister. And now it had cost him everything. The man stood still for a moment, looking down at the lifeless body of the pastor. The only sound was the faint drip of blood onto the cold floor. Each drop seemed to slow time itself. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. This was no ordinary murder. It was the end of a twisted game. The man slowly pulled the knife from Alan's chest, wiping the blade against the pastor's robes, the fabric darkening with a crimson stain. The air around him felt charged, alive with tension. He glanced up at the stained glass windows, where a sliver of moonlight shone through, casting eerie shadows across the room. The fog outside had thickened, and the church felt more like a tomb now. There was no escape. The man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn letter. He placed it on the altar with trembling hands. Then, without a word, he turned and walked toward the door. His footsteps were deliberate, each one echoing in the silent church. The door creaked open, the hinges groaning in protest. As he stepped into the fog, the chills seemed to consume him. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The man knew that once the truth was out, there would be no going back. But what was the truth? What had driven him to this? Alan's life, his facade of righteousness, had been a lie.
But the man knew more than that.
He knew the pastor had been involved in something far darker, something that had twisted the core of this once peaceful town. The man had been tracking the pastor for months. But even now, as he stepped into the night, he didn't feel the weight of the murder on his conscience. Because this wasn't just about the death of one man. This was about the countless others Alan had destroyed, the innocent lives that had been lost along the way. The facade of the holy man who had led them all to believe in something that was never there. He was just one piece in a much larger puzzle. And now, with the pastor dead, the truth had begun to unfold. But even in death, Alan had one last secret. One final piece of the story. The man paused. He reached into his coat pocket again and pulled out a small, crumpled photo. He studied it for a moment before slipping it back into the folds of his coat. The fog swirled around him. The night felt colder still. But the story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The man stood there for a long moment, his breath visible in the freezing air. The fog seemed to wrap around him, as if trying to conceal his next move. He glanced back toward the church, feeling the weight of what he had done. But his mind was already elsewhere, focused on what had come before. On the secrets that the pastor had kept buried. Alan had been hiding something much darker than anyone had ever realized. The man clenched his fists, the photo still hidden in his coat. His pulse quickened as memories flooded his mind. He had once been just like everyone else. He had trusted Alan, believed in him, but everything had changed. The fog thickened, curling around him like a shroud. The man's thoughts began to race. He had been searching for answers for years. And now, with the pastor's death, those answers were within reach. The photo he carried, he had found it among Alan's things. A small, almost unnoticeable image tucked in the back of a drawer. It wasn't just any photo. It was a picture of a woman. Her face was obscured, but the eyes were unmistakable. The man's stomach churned at the memory. The woman in the photo was his sister. And she had vanished years ago. No one knew what had happened to her. The police had called it an unsolved case. But the man had always known. He had always known that Alan was involved. Now, with the pastor's life ended, the man's search for the truth had reached its boiling point. He had been close to breaking the story wide open before. But Alan had always been one step ahead. But now, the man would make sure that no stone was left unturned. He would expose every last secret. Because Alan had taken something that could never be returned. He had taken his sister's life. And now, the man was going to make sure Alan paid for it. The fog thickened further, swallowing up the road ahead. The man's steps were steady now. No hesitation. His mission was clear. He wasn't done. Not by a long shot. And the town would soon learn that there were far more secrets lurking beneath the surface than they ever could have imagined. The real story of what Alan had truly been hiding was just beginning. The town slept, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. The man walked through the mist, his mind racing. He could still feel the weight of the knife in his hand, the way it had sunk into Alan's flesh. But that wasn't the end of it. It was only the beginning. The past wasn't finished with him. The past never really lets go. As he moved deeper into the fog, the man's thoughts returned to that photo. The woman with the haunting eyes. His sister. Her disappearance had shattered everything. The police had scoured the town, asked questions, followed leads. But they hadn't found a thing. They had no idea what Alan had done. And now the man had all the pieces. But there was one thing he had to do first. He had to find the woman. The photo he carried was old, faded. But her eyes, they haunted him. He had seen those eyes before, years ago, when he was a child and his sister had been taken from him. The memories flooded back. Too many to count. And he knew. He knew Alan had been the one to destroy her. The fog seemed to close in tighter around him, muffling his every step. He had to find her. There was a place that Alan had always visited. A cabin hidden deep in the woods, on the outskirts of town. The man had never been able to confirm anything until now. The pastor had visited the cabin often, late at night. No one had ever seen him leave. The man's steps quickened. His destination was clear. As he neared the edge of town, the streets grew emptier. The houses stood silent, their windows dark. But there was a sense of urgency now, a sense of reckoning. He needed to uncover the truth, once and for all, to confront the darkness that had lingered for too long. His footsteps grew louder, as if the ground itself was warning him. But he pressed on. The fog parted just enough to reveal the trail that led to the cabin. The trees ahead seemed to bend under the weight of history. It wasn't just a cabin. It was a monument to everything Alan had hidden. The man reached the cabin's door. His breath came fast, his pulse pounding in his ears. And he pushed it open. The room inside was dim, the air heavy with dust and decay. A faint light flickered from the corner, illuminating an old, wooden table. The man stepped inside, and as his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. On the table lay a set of old photographs, and one of them was of his sister. Her face, pale and lifeless, stared back at him. But there was more. A letter, yellowed with age, sat beside the photo. He reached for it, his fingers trembling as he unfolded the paper. It was in Alan's handwriting, and it told a story the town had never known. The letter crackled in his hands as he slowly unfolded it, the weight of its words pressing down on him. The flickering light cast shadows across the cabin, making the room feel colder than before. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes scanned the paper, the ink faint but legible. It began with a name he hadn't heard in years, his sister's name. Margaret, the letter read. The man's heart raced. He had never expected this. Never expected to find her name written in Alan's hand. The words on the page seemed to blur for a moment, his mind struggling to process what he was reading. Alan had known Margaret, had been close to her, much closer than he ever realized. The letter spoke of promises made, promises of safety, of protection. But those promises were lies. Alan had manipulated her, twisted her trust. The letter went on to describe the night Margaret disappeared, the night the pastor had taken her, the night he had betrayed her completely. The man's chest tightened. He could feel the anger rising in him, the sense of betrayal and grief churning in his stomach. It wasn't just his sister Alan had destroyed, it was his entire family. The letter continued, describing how Alan had hidden her away, locked in this very cabin. How he had kept her hidden from the world, from anyone who could find out. The man's hand trembled as he turned the letter over, but it was the last line that truly stopped him. It read, "She is still here." The words burned into his mind. His sister, his dear, lost sister, was still here. In this cabin. Her fate, her life, had been sealed the moment Alan had taken her. The man's breath hitched, his legs nearly giving way beneath him. He was on the edge of something far worse than he could have imagined. He stepped further into the cabin, his eyes frantically searching the shadows. The walls seemed to close in around him, suffocating him in the knowledge of what had happened. And then he saw it. A door at the back of the room, partially ajar. A sliver of darkness beyond. He approached it slowly, his every step heavy with dread. As he pushed the door open, a cold breeze brushed past him, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. Inside, the room was small, almost claustrophobic. There was a cot in the corner, the sheets twisted and torn. And then, on the wall opposite, a large wooden chest. The man's heart pounded as he approached it, every instinct telling him to turn away. But he couldn't. He had to know. His fingers grasped the lid, and with a deep breath, he opened it. What lay inside stopped him cold. The chest was empty, except for a single blood-stained cloth. And another photograph. This time it was of Alan. The pastor's face was twisted in anguish, his eyes wide with terror. The photograph had been taken in this very cabin. But what struck the man was the writing on the back. It simply said, "The truth is buried here." And with that, everything he had believed, everything he had come to know, shattered in an instant. The truth was more horrifying than he could have ever imagined. The cabin wasn't just a hiding place, it was a grave. A tomb. And Alan wasn't the only one hiding secrets. The fog outside had lifted. But the man could no longer escape the darkness that had consumed him. Everything had led to this moment. Everything had led to the truth. And now he had to decide what to do with it. The man stood frozen, staring at the photograph in his hand. The air in the cabin felt suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in on him. He had been searching for answers, but what he found was a nightmare. The truth he had uncovered wasn't just a betrayal, it was something far more chilling. The photograph of Alan's face, twisted in terror, was a reflection of something far darker than anyone had imagined. The truth wasn't buried in the ground. It was buried in the man's own past. The letter, the photograph, the empty chest, it all pointed to one horrifying reality. Margaret hadn't just been hidden away. She had been erased. The truth was not just about a man who had done unspeakable things. It was about the very fabric of their shared history. Alan had been hiding something far more sinister than his involvement in the disappearance of a woman. The pastor had orchestrated a plan to destroy not just his sister, but anyone who posed a threat to his secrets. The man's hands shook as he clutched the photo tighter, his mind racing. The fog outside had lifted, but in his chest, a storm brewed. He had come here looking for answers about Alan. But now, he realized, the answers would lead to more questions. Questions he wasn't sure he wanted to face. The truth about Margaret's disappearance, about the things Alan had done, had never been simple. It had always been entangled with lies, manipulation, and darkness. And now, the man knew what he had to do. He had to bring it all to light. He wasn't done yet. The fog may have lifted from the town, but the shadows still lurked in the corners of his mind. The man turned and stepped away from the chest, his mind made up. He would go to the authorities. He would expose everything. There was no turning back now. He had uncovered the truth, and now it was time for the town to face it. Time for the darkness to be dragged into the light. But as he made his way to the door, the faintest sound echoed through the cabin. A rustle. A movement from the corner. He froze. His breath hitched. Was there someone else here? The cabin, empty just moments ago, suddenly felt much smaller. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the room. And there, in the farthest corner, was something that hadn't been there before. A shadow. A figure. Someone or something was watching him. The man's pulse quickened. His hands trembled as he stepped closer. And then, in the dim light, he saw it. A figure, sitting still just out of reach. It was a woman. Her face was hidden in the shadows, but the outline of her silhouette was unmistakable. The man's heart stopped. Could it be? Could this be his sister? The woman's eyes flicked up to meet his. Her face was pale, her hair wild and matted. Her gaze was empty, lost. But there was something in her eyes that sent a chill straight to the man's spine. A quiet whisper filled the room, barely audible. You shouldn't have come. The man took a step back, his mind reeling. And then it hit him. The woman wasn't his sister. But she knew something. Something he wasn't ready to hear. And the truth was more monstrous than he could ever have imagined. The door to the cabin slammed shut behind him.
He was trapped.
The door slammed with a deafening thud, the sound reverberating through the walls of the cabin. The man spun around, heart racing, but the woman remained where she sat, her face still hidden in the shadows. Her voice had been a whisper, but it carried a weight that felt like chains wrapping around his chest. You shouldn't have come, she repeated, her voice barely audible, yet sharp like a knife. The man's breath quickened, his mind reeling from the sudden turn of events. He had thought he was alone. He had thought the cabin was empty, save for the evidence of Alan's sins. But now, this stranger, this woman, was sitting before him, watching him with an unsettling calm. He took a step back, his eyes never leaving her. Who are you? His voice was hoarse, the words scraping his throat. For a long moment, there was no answer. Only the rustle of air, the silence thickening in the room. And then, as if the woman were deciding whether or not to answer, she spoke again. Everything you've found here, she said, her voice barely more than a breath. It's only the beginning. The words sent a shiver through him. The beginning? What did that mean? The man's gaze darted to the corner of the room where the chest had been opened. The photograph of Alan, the blood-stained cloth, the empty space, it all felt like part of a puzzle that was missing its final pieces. You know about Alan, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. What happened to Margaret? Where is she? The woman's head tilted slightly, a faint flicker of something in her eyes, a recognition of his pain, perhaps. You think Alan is the only one who's been hiding secrets? She asked, her voice almost mocking. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. What do you mean? The man's mind raced, his pulse thundering in his ears. The woman stood up slowly, the motion deliberate, as if she had all the time in the world. Her eyes never left his. Alan may have started this, but he wasn't the only one. You've been looking for your sister, but you've been blind to everything else. She took a step forward, the air between them thick with tension. The man's heart pounded harder, his instincts telling him to run, to escape. But he couldn't. Something held him there. Do you really think the pastor was the one who made her disappear? She asked, her voice growing colder. The question made his chest tighten. He had always thought Alan had been the one to take Margaret, the one to orchestrate everything. But now, doubt began to creep in. The woman stepped closer, her figure now more defined in the dim light of the cabin. No, she whispered.
You don't understand.
Alan didn't take her. She was never taken. She was chosen. The words landed like a blow. The man's mind spun. What was she saying? Chosen, he repeated, disbelief in his voice. What does that mean? Where is she? What happened to her? The woman's lips curled into a grim smile. She became part of something bigger, something darker, something you could never have imagined. The man stepped back, his body tingling with dread. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion. Why are you telling me this? What do you want from me? Her eyes locked onto his, her expression unreadable. I'm telling you because it's too late. The truth doesn't set you free. It chains you to the darkness. And you're already too deep in it. The air around them grew colder, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch longer, like they were closing in on him. The woman took another step forward, and as she did, the room seemed to shift. The light from the single bulb flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. You came here to find answers, but you've just discovered the beginning of the end, she whispered. The man could barely breathe. His chest tightened, as if the very air was being sucked out of the cabin. He had wanted the truth. But now, the truth was consuming him. The woman took one final step forward, her eyes never leaving his. And in that moment, the man realized just how far gone he was. He couldn't escape the darkness. And it was only just beginning to swallow him whole. The woman's presence in the room felt like a weight pressing down on him, her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that sent a chill straight through his veins. Every step she took seemed to draw the shadows closer, suffocating him, leaving him no room to breathe. The air was thick, heavy, like the walls were closing in, and the only thing that remained was the pounding of his own heart. "You're too late," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper, but it carried like a thunderclap in the stillness of the cabin. "The darkness has already claimed you. There's no escaping it now." The words felt like a verdict, a final judgment, sealing his fate. He tried to move, to speak, but his body refused to obey, rooted to the spot as if some unseen force held him there. The woman stepped closer, her movements slow, deliberate. There was no fear in her, only a cold, quiet certainty. "Do you still believe you can save her?" she asked, her gaze piercing. "You think uncovering the truth will bring her back? You think it will fix everything? It won't. The damage is done." His thoughts spun wildly, trying to process the enormity of what she was saying. She had to be lying. His sister had to be alive. He couldn't let himself believe otherwise. But the woman's eyes held a darkness that was undeniable, a kind of knowledge that made him question everything he thought he knew. You know what happened to her," he finally managed to rasp. His throat felt tight, constricted. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into the folds of her coat and pulled out a small, worn piece of paper, an old photograph. She held it up, her fingers trembling slightly. It was a picture of Margaret. But she was different. Her eyes were vacant, her smile twisted in a way that was unnatural, as if the life had been drained from her completely. She didn't look like the sister he had known, the girl who had once been his closest confidant. The man's breath caught in his throat. What is this?" he whispered, his voice shaking. The woman's lips curled into a sad, almost pitying smile. "It's what she became," she said quietly. "She was never taken. She was transformed." His mind reeled, unable to process her words. Transformed? What did that even mean? Before he could ask, she continued, her voice taking on a darker edge. "Alan didn't just hide her. He changed her. She's still here, yes, but not in the way you think. The woman you're looking for is gone." The man's pulse raced. His hands trembled as he reached for the photo, his mind swimming with disbelief. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be true. But as his fingers grazed the edges of the photo, something inside him twisted. A gut-wrenching sense of wrongness. The picture wasn't just a picture of his sister. It was a warning. And then, the woman stepped closer, her voice lowering to a near whisper. "Do you hear her?" she asked, her tone chilling. "She's still here, inside this cabin. But you'll never find her. She's locked away, just like the others." The man looked around frantically, his eyes scanning the room, but there was nothing. No sign of life, no trace of his sister. Just the emptiness. And then something shifted. The air around him grew colder still, and for the briefest of moments, he thought he heard something, a soft, almost inaudible whisper. A voice. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. It was Margaret's voice. "Help me." The words sent a jolt of terror through his body. His vision blurred, his heart racing. "Margaret," he called out, his voice breaking. "Where are you? Please, I need to know where you are." The woman smiled softly, a glimmer of something like pity in her eyes.
"She's gone," she said simply.
"She's never coming back." The man shook his head, desperate.
"No."
"No, I won't believe that. I'll find her. I'll find the truth." But as the words left his mouth, he felt the room begin to close in, the darkness swallowing him whole. The woman stepped back, disappearing into the shadows, leaving him alone in the suffocating gloom. And for the first time, he realized that the truth he sought wasn't something that could be found. It was something that would destroy him. The whisper of Margaret's voice still echoed in his ears, a haunting call that sent chills down his spine. The cabin, once a place of quiet solitude, now felt like a tomb. The walls seemed to shift, closing in on him with each breath. He could no longer tell if the whispers were real or just in his mind. His heart pounded, each beat growing louder, more frantic. "Help me," the words repeated, a desperate plea that tore through his thoughts. He looked around, his eyes wild, searching for the source. But there was nothing, just the suffocating darkness and the oppressive silence. The woman, whoever she was, had disappeared into the shadows, leaving him alone with the crushing weight of her words.
"She's gone," she had said.
But those words didn't make sense. He couldn't accept them. He wouldn't. The picture of Margaret was still clutched in his trembling hands. Her lifeless, vacant expression stared back at him, a stark reminder of everything he had lost. But now he understood. What had happened to her wasn't just an abduction. It was something far worse. His mind screamed for answers, for some thread of hope to follow. But there was nothing. Just the cold, suffocating air and the distant, haunting whisper. The man stumbled toward the door, his steps unsteady, driven by a single thought. He had to get out. He had to find the truth. The truth, no matter what it cost. As his hand grasped the doorknob, something stopped him. A cold pressure settled in the pit of his stomach. The door was locked. He turned it again, but it refused to budge. His breath hitched, panic rising in his chest. "No," he whispered to himself. "This isn't happening." He slammed his fist against the door, the wood splintering slightly under the impact. But it didn't open. And then, as if the cabin itself had heard his distress, the temperature dropped even further. The very air felt thick and oppressive, like it was pressing in on him from all sides. The whisper grew louder, closer. "Help me." His heart raced, his pulse roaring in his ears. "Where are you?" he shouted into the empty room. "What have you done to her?" But no answer came. Only the sound of his own ragged breathing filled the room. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything fell silent. The air was still. The whisper was gone. And for a moment, he thought he was imagining everything. But when he turned around, his eyes fell on the shadows in the corner of the room, the very spot where the woman had been standing. And there, in the dim light, he saw it. A figure, a silhouette, Margaret. Her form was faint, like a ghost, an apparition. Her eyes were wide, vacant, just like in the photo, but now there was something more. Something darker. Her skin was pale, her body almost translucent, and her mouth moved, though no sound came from it. The man's breath caught in his throat as he took a step forward. "And Margaret," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The figure in front of him twitched, its head jerking to one side, a movement so unnatural that it made his skin crawl. Then she spoke. "You shouldn't have come." Her voice was not her own. It was hollow, like the words had been ripped from the depths of the earth itself. The man stumbled backward, his eyes wide with disbelief. This wasn't his sister. This was something else, something far worse. The figure advanced, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled by something dark and malevolent. "No, no," "This isn't real," the man whispered, shaking his head. "This can't be happening." But the figure kept coming, its hollow eyes locked onto his. And with every step it took, the room grew darker. He could feel it then, the pull of something ancient and terrible. Something that had waited for years in the shadows, hidden beneath layers of lies and secrets. The man's heart raced in his chest, and he felt the walls of the cabin closing in tighter. There was no escape. He was trapped, caught in the very nightmare he had been running from all along. And as the figure reached out for him, its cold fingers brushing against his skin, he realized with horror that the truth was no longer something he could run from. It had already consumed him, and there was no turning back. The cold touch of the figure's fingers sent a jolt of ice through his body, freezing him in place. His breath caught in his throat as he stood there, unable to move, his heart pounding louder with every second that passed. The shadowed figure, Margaret, or whatever she had become, was close now. Too close. Her face, once the face of his sister, was now nothing but a hollow, vacant mask. Her eyes were wide, glassy, as if she were staring into an abyss beyond comprehension. Her mouth moved again, but the words that came out were not her own. "You should have stayed away," she whispered, the voice not hers but something darker, deeper. The words sounded like a warning, a final, unforgiving judgment. The man's throat tightened, the very air around him growing heavier. His legs felt like lead, and despite every ounce of willpower, he couldn't tear himself away from her grasp. There was nowhere to run. He had thought, for a brief moment, that finding the truth would free him, that uncovering the hidden darkness of this cabin would give him the answers he so desperately sought. But now it seemed the truth was his prison. The figure moved closer, her outstretched hand brushing his face with a chilling caress. "Help me," she whispered again, her voice breaking like a crack in ice, and for an agonizing moment, he saw his sister's face, just a flicker, a memory, beneath the veil of the thing before him. But then the illusion vanished, and all that remained was the hollow stare of the creature she had become. He gasped for air, his chest tightening, his vision swimming. The shadows in the cabin seemed to ripple, twisting and turning as if alive, pulling him in, surrounding him. The walls seemed to close in even tighter, the floor groaning beneath him as though the very foundation of the cabin were shifting. He had been so sure, so desperate to find Margaret, to uncover the truth. But now he realized that the truth was no salvation. It was a sentence, a condemnation. He stumbled backward, his hands shaking, but the figure, Margaret, was always there, always just an inch away, her eyes following him, as if pulling him deeper into the darkness. The cabin felt like it was suffocating him, the walls pressing in, the air thick with the weight of 1,000 unspoken horrors. He wanted to scream, but his voice was lost in the suffocating silence that had taken hold of the place. "Why?" The words slipped from his lips before he could stop it, a desperate plea. "Why are you doing this?" Margaret's face twisted into something grotesque, her mouth opening wide, as if to answer. But no sound came. Instead, the walls seemed to respond, the floor beneath his feet groaning, shifting as though the house itself was alive. And then, there was a sound, soft at first, like a distant murmur, but growing louder. The whispers, the voices, the hidden things that had been trapped here for so long. He realized with a shock that it wasn't just Margaret. There were others here. Others who had been hidden away. Others who had been lost to the darkness. His hands clenched into fists, his heart racing as the reality of it all settled in. The truth, this unthinkable truth, was not just about a single disappearance. It was about a history of horrors. A cycle that had been repeating itself, hidden beneath the surface for years. Margaret's disappearance had been the key that had unlocked the horrors of this place. The man could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him, suffocating him. His mind screamed for an escape, but his body was frozen, trapped in this nightmare that had become all too real. As the shadows grew, the voices grew louder. And with them, the unbearable truth became clear. There was no escaping this place. No escaping the darkness that had claimed so many before him. The walls were no longer just walls. They were tombs. Tombs that held the secrets of the past, the lost souls, the forgotten ones. The truth was the thing that had been buried all these years. And now it had him.
He was a part of it.
He was another lost soul, another victim of the curse that had cursed this cabin for generations. And as the figure moved closer, the darkness around him closing in, he realized with a final, crushing certainty. He would never leave. The truth had swallowed him whole. The man's body trembled, his pulse thrumming in his ears. He stood at the heart of the suffocating darkness, his mind a whirlwind of terror, confusion, and regret. The walls, once solid and familiar, now seemed to pulse with life, as though the cabin itself had become a living entity, breathing with him, suffocating him. He had wanted the truth, the twisted, sickening truth, but now, in this moment, he understood. The truth was not something to be uncovered. It was a curse. Margaret's form lingered in the shadows, her hollow eyes locked onto his. She had become something else, something that he couldn't comprehend. The woman he had once known, the sister he had loved, was gone, replaced by something dark, something ancient. "Help me," her voice whispered again, though it wasn't the voice of his sister. It was something deeper, older, an echo from the depths of something far worse than he had ever imagined. He tried to move, tried to scream, but the air was thick and suffocating. His legs felt like they were made of stone, weighed down by the heavy truth of what he had uncovered. There was no escape, no way out. In the corner of the room, something else moved, shadows shifting, something stirring. His eyes darted to the corner, but it was too late. The darkness reached out for him, curling around his limbs, dragging him toward the heart of the cabin. He fought against it, but it was futile. The walls pressed in, the floor buckled beneath him, and he felt the darkness swallow him whole. "Please," he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "I just wanted to save her." But the shadows didn't respond. They simply consumed him, pulling him deeper into the cabin's depths, where the lost souls lingered, trapped in their own torment. And then the silence returned, a deep, suffocating silence that held him in its grip. The man was no more, and the cabin remained unchanged, waiting for the next soul to stumble into its deadly embrace. Days turned to weeks and weeks to months. The cabin, once a place of secrets and horrors, stood in the middle of the forest, silent, abandoned, and forgotten. No one ventured close, not after the rumors began to spread. The whispers of a cursed place, a place that claimed all who sought to uncover its dark past, kept everyone at bay. The man, the one who had come searching for answers, had never been seen again. His disappearance, like so many others before him, became just another tragic story, a tale to be whispered in the shadows. And yet, the cabin remained. Its walls, once alive with secrets and torment, now stood still. The heavy air had lifted, but the stain of what had occurred within those walls lingered. No one would ever know the full truth, not the full extent of the horrors that had been hidden there for generations. Margaret, too, had vanished, her presence nothing more than a distant memory, a ghost in the place where once she had lived. Her soul, twisted and lost, was now part of the darkness that lingered, a part of the cursed cycle that had claimed so many before her. It was said that the cabin could never be destroyed, that no matter how much time passed, no matter how many seasons came and went, the dark energy within its walls would never dissipate. It was as if the house itself had become one with the land, its roots tangled so deep that nothing could sever them. And then, one day, years after the man had disappeared, a hiker, a curious soul, came upon the cabin. He looked at it with the same wonder and unease that so many had felt before him. But he didn't know what had happened here. He didn't know the truth. He walked toward the door, curiosity tugging at him, unaware that the cabin, like all the others before him, was waiting for the next soul to seek what should never be found. And so, the cycle began again. Years passed, but the cabin never truly faded from the land. It stood there in the wilderness, its once weathered exterior now covered in vines and creeping moss, as if nature itself had tried to swallow the dark history it held within. The world moved on, but the shadow of the cabin remained, an unsettling memory in the hearts of those who had heard the whispers. The man who had come seeking answers, who had ventured too far into the heart of darkness, was never found. No trace of him was ever uncovered. His disappearance became just another chilling story, added to the countless others that were shared in hushed tones, around campfires or in the corners of bars. A man, driven by grief and a desire for truth, lost to the very truth he had sought. And yet, even with his absence, something about the cabin still lingered, something in the air, in the very ground beneath it. The trees around it grew taller, their branches stretching into the sky, as if trying to shield the house from the rest of the world. But the secrets inside could never be concealed for long. Time, as it always does, moved forward. The forest around the cabin grew thicker, wilder, more untamed. But every now and then, someone would stumble upon the forgotten structure, usually a wanderer, a lost soul seeking refuge or adventure. They'd look at it from a distance, noticing the windows that seemed to watch them, the door slightly ajar, as if beckoning them inside. But no one dared approach. The fear of the place, of the stories, of the curse that seemed to hang heavy in the air, kept people away. And so, the cabin stood alone, a silent monument to the lost. To the man who came searching for his sister, to the woman who had become something else, to the countless souls who had come before and after them. And in the silence of the forest, the cabin waited. It waited for the next lost soul to wander too close, to seek the truth, and to fall into the same trap as so many before them. The cycle, as it always had, would continue, and the cabin would remain, its secrets buried, but never forgotten.